The House has resumed. Members, the House is considering the interim report of the Privileges Committee on the question of privilege regarding the use of intrusive powers within the parliamentary precinct. Grant Robertson has the call. He's just over 3.5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker.
Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying before the dinner break, one of the major issues within this report is the blurring of the lines between the executive and Parliament. And as parliamentarians, we guard jealously the privileges and rights that are given to us here as parliamentarians. The distinction between what parliamentary service does for us as parliamentarians and what is done for ministers was one of the issues that arose. But the significant issue was around the release of data that was about members. As I said before the break, Jeff Thorne, who was then the head of the Parliamentary Service, 3 times refused to release that information, but on the intervention of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, acting on behalf of the Prime Minister, he did release that information. And we believe on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, that contradicts what the Prime Minister said throughout the period of this inquiry, that he wasn't involved in it. He quite clearly was. He set the terms of reference for it. He was the person whose Chief of Staff was intimately involved throughout the process and made the very critical intervention that saw data released. As I've also noted before the dinner break, I'm not saying that that was the only piece of blame that could be apportioned out of this. It's quite clear there was plenty of blame to go around, and David Henry and his inquiry team overreached. But this was the Prime Minister's inquiry that they were undertaking. Mr. Speaker, in the time remaining, I want to talk about a couple of issues. One of those is the question of metadata versus content, which was a significant debate during the GCSB bill. And it's worth noting that in this inquiry, it was the release of metadata, the so-called information about information, that was actually critical to what happened. The reason David Henry found out that there were 86 emails between Peter Dunn and Andrea Vance was because of the metadata. Now, that metadata, some of it was not meant to be released, apparently, although that argument was one that I'll come to in a minute, but that the government felt that it wasn't meant to be released. But if New Zealanders are to have confidence in the security of their information, metadata is significant. The content of emails was requested, and eventually some was released inadvertently, some was released deliberately, some was pulled back. But it was that metadata that was the critical element in this investigation. And when we are considering the security of New Zealanders' data generally, I think we have to bear that in mind, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a sorry saga. The Henry inquiry was poorly run, it was poorly set up. Those involved in it were not conscious of the boundaries between the executive and Parliament. They rode roughshod over those boundaries. But at the end of the day, New Zealanders are still none the wiser as to who actually leaked the Kitteridge report, a sensitive, confidential document. The Prime Minister set up an inquiry to do that. Today he tells us he may let Peter Dunn back into Cabinet. That is only possible for him to do that if he believes that someone else other than Peter Dunn leaked the Kitteridge report. New Zealanders are owed an explanation by John Key as to who leaked the Kitteridge report. He has not provided that, and as a result, New Zealanders will not have confidence in his word.
Quite right. David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I just begin my comments by noting